Welcome to Meteorology Matters.
Glad to be here.
Today we're going to unpack a recent article. It really pulls back the curtain on some pretty significant things happening with how vital weather and climate information is being managed or maybe mismanaged and shared here in the U.S.
Yeah, the source we're diving into, it focuses specifically on events within the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. NOAA.
Right, NOAA. And our goal today really is to get into the details that this article presents. Try to understand what's actually been reported.
What's going on?
Yeah, what's going on. And maybe most importantly, explore why these changes could actually matter quite a bit to you listening at home and, well, anyone who relies on good, solid information about our environment.
Definitely. Because the focus here is on climate.gov.
Climate.gov, yeah. Now, if you're not familiar, this isn't some, obscure government page.
Yeah,
It's described as a really key public-facing website for NOAA.
it really was. Kind of the front porch for a lot of their climate information.
Exactly. Designed specifically to be that bridge, right?
Yeah.
Between the complex science NOAA does and, well, us, the general public.
Uh-huh. People go there, or I guess used to go there, looking for understandable info on everything from, long-term climate change stuff
That's
to...
things like El Nino, right?
Yeah.
Those big cyclical patterns that affect our weather season to season.
Precisely. So this deep dive, it's really about exploring the specifics reported in this source. What actions were taken, why the people involved think they were taken.
Right, the perceived reasons.
Yeah, and the value of what might be getting lost here. And then maybe some of the worries people have about what comes next.
It sounds like it really digs into the stakes, for public access to government science.
That's the core of it.
Okay, so let's start at the beginning. Let's unpack the situation itself,
Yeah.
specifically at climate.gov. We probably need to understand what it was first. Like, what was its main job, its mission?
Well, the source lays it out pretty clearly. Its fundamental purpose, its core mission, was supporting public education on climate science.
Public education. So not just for scientists talking to scientists.
No, absolutely not. The whole goal was to translate all that research, the data, the complex understanding NOAA has about the climate system
Uh-huh.
into formats that anyone could basically grasp. Articles, maps, cool interactives, videos, making it accessible.
So a big tool for science literacy, specifically about climate.
You got it. And the article gives us its address within NOAA, too, organizationally speaking.
Right, where did it actually live inside that huge agency?
Okay, so it served as the main gateway website for NOAA's Climate Program Office. That makes sense.
Okay.
But here's an interesting detail the article points out. The site itself and the team resided within NOAA's Communication, Education, and Engagement Division.
Communication, education, and engagement. That sounds significant.
It is. The source actually describes this division as the single largest team in the entire federal government dedicated specifically to climate communication, education, and engagement.
Wow. The largest team in the whole government. That suggests a really serious, dedicated effort towards public outreach on climate.
It really does. It's a substantial commitment. And there's another layer to this, a detail the article highlights about the editorial team specifically, where they sat in the structure.
Ah, right. The people actually writing the stuff, making the content. Where were they?
Okay, this is important. According to the source, this team, the content creators, they weren't under the general public affairs umbrella. They were housed specifically within the science division.
Inside the science division, not with the main PR folk.
Exactly. And according to the article, citing the former staff, this was apparently a very deliberate choice.
Why? What was the thinking there?
The idea was to ensure the content was driven purely by the science, by accuracy, by independence, to sort of shield it from potential, political messaging or PR spin that might influence a public affairs office.
So keeping it rooted firmly in the science itself, prioritizing scientific integrity in what they communicated.
That seems to have been the rationale. Make sure the science came first, unfiltered.
Okay, so let's recap that foundation quickly. We have this major public education website, climate.gov, part of a very large communication and education effort within NOAA.
Right. The biggest in the federal government for climate comms.
And critically, the team actually producing the content was embedded within the science division, specifically to keep it independent and scientifically rigorous.
That's the picture painted by the source.
Okay, that definitely sets the stage. Now, the events. The core of the article. It reports a, quote, mass termination of staff. What happened there? What are the specifics?
Yeah, this is the headline event, really. The article states pretty starkly that the entire content production staff at climate.gov were let go.
The entire team.
The entire team responsible for creating that public-facing content. It wasn't like a few cuts here and there or a reorganization. It was a whole group.
Wow. Do we know how many people that was?
The source estimates it was about 10 contracted staff members on this specific team.
10 people. The whole engine driving the content for a major government science website. Gone. Just like that. And the timing. The article gives a specific date, right?
It does. May 31st, 2025. That date, May 31st, becomes relevant later when we talk about contracts and things.
Okay, May 31st. And weren't these the only recent changes involving people connected to climate.gov or NOAA comms? The article mentioned some earlier stuff, too.
That's right. It wasn't totally out of the blue if you were watching closely, maybe. The report highlights that Rebecca Lindsay, who is the site's former program manager...
The person in charge of the whole thing.
Yeah, she was reportedly fired back in February 2025, so just a few months before the whole team got the axe.
Okay, and was there any reason given for her dismissal?
Well, the article notes it happened as part of what was characterized at the time as a, quote, purge of probationary employees.
A purge. That sounds dramatic.
It does, but what the source adds, which makes her case stand out, is the context. Apparently, she had just received a stellar performance review, a bonus, and a raise.
Seriously. So high marks, bonus, raise, then fired as part of a purge.
That's the sequence reported. Suggests her work was, very highly valued internally right up until the point she was let go. Kind of raises questions.
Yeah, you'd think. So the manager, highly rated, is gone in February. Then a few months later, the entire team she managed is terminated. The article also mentions someone else, Tom DiLiberto.
Right. He's described as a former NOAA spokesperson. He was also reportedly fired earlier in 2025.
Another communications person.
Yes. Now, the article doesn't explicitly draw a straight line, like saying his firing caused the climate.gov team's dismissal, but it presents these individual departures of key comms people as, well, part of a pattern leading up to the bigger move against the content team.
Okay. So the former staff who were interviewed, they likely see these earlier events as connected, looking back.
That's definitely the impression given in the source. They interpret these earlier firings through the lens of what happened later to the whole team.
All right, so we've got this pattern. Key individuals in communication and program management roles let go earlier in the year, culminating in the dismissal of the entire content production team for climate.gov on May 31st.
Yeah.
What's the immediate fallout? Like, for the website itself, what happens now if you go there?
Well, according to the former staff quoted in the article, the direct, immediate consequence is pretty blunt. The website will, quote, imminently no longer publish new content.
No new content at all.
They mentioned there might be, a few articles or features that were already written and scheduled to go live in early June. Stuff that was maybe queued up before the firings.
Okay, a trickle maybe?
Trickle, exactly. But, and this is the critical part, they state there are absolutely no plans for further new content after that pre-scheduled stuff runs out.
No plans, full stop.
Yeah.
Wow. What does that signal about the future of the site itself, does the article say?
That's where it gets really fuzzy. The source includes a quote from a former contractor saying, basically, after that, we have no idea what will happen to the website.
Just uncertainty.
Total uncertainty. The article doesn't seem to have a clear statement from NOAA or the administration about their plans for climate.gov long term. Will they keep it online as like a static museum?
An archive. Yeah.
Or will they just pull the plug entirely? Or maybe something else. The only immediate certainty reported is that its role as a living, updated source of climate science info for the public. That's over.
Okay, let me try to summarize the what happened then.
Yeah.
We have this well-regarded government site, climate.gov, inside NOAA, focused on nonpartisan climate science education.
Right.
Its entire content team, about 10 contractors, was dismissed on May 31st. This followed earlier, somewhat puzzling dismissals of key people like the program manager. And the immediate result is the site stops getting updated very, very soon. And its ultimate fate, totally unclear.
That sums up the situation described in the source material perfectly.
Okay, that's the what's. Now, the really thorny part, maybe the most sensitive piece in the article, the why. According to the source, especially the people who used to work there, what's the reason? What's the motivation they see behind all this?
Right. This is where the article moves into the interpretation based on the experiences of those directly impacted. And they don't hold back. The former staff members interviewed, they are explicit. They believe these changes were specifically, quote, targeted by political appointees within the Trump administration.
Targeted by political appointees.
Oh,
So
no.
they don't see this as just, budget cuts or streamlining.
No. Their interpretation, as reported, is that this wasn't some neutral bureaucratic decision. They see it as a deliberate action stemming from a specific political direction within the current administration.
Okay. And what purpose do they think this alleged targeting served? What was the goal in their view?
According to these former staff, the intent they perceived was explicitly aimed at, quote, restricting public-facing climate information.
Restricting information.
Yeah. They believed the goal was to limit, maybe control, perhaps even suppress the flow of climate science understanding science generated by the government from reaching the American public.
That's a pretty serious claim.
It is. Rebecca Lindsay, the former manager, used strong words. She characterized it as a very deliberate, targeted attack, specifically on that communication function and that team.
A targeted attack on public climate info access.
Wow. How did they say this happened? Like, what was the mechanism used for this alleged targeting? The article apparently links it to a contract.
Yes, exactly. Lindsay's account, as reported, connects it directly to a large NOAA contract. And crucially, this contract was apparently up for renewal right at the end of May.
The same time the team was fired, May 31st.
Precisely. She recounted being told by her former boss that a demand had come from above, implying, higher-ups in the administration, to rewrite specific parts of that contract renewal document.
Rewrite it how? The specific instruction, as she was told and relayed in the article, was to remove the funding line item that specifically paid for the climate.gov content team's work.
So use the contract renewal process, something routine, to zero out the funding for just that one specific team.
That's the mechanism described. Leveraging a standard administrative process to achieve a very specific targeted outcome against this particular team and its function.
That paints a picture of how, bureaucratic levers could potentially be pulled to target something specific. What arguments did the former staff offer in the source to back up this idea that it was targeted, that it wasn't just, say, part of some bigger across-the-board cut?
One of the main arguments, highlighted particularly by Tom DiLiberto, the former spokesperson, it centers on just how precise the cuts were, who got fired and who didn't. He's quoted saying something like, they only fired a handful of people, and it just so happened to be the entire content team for climate.gov. I mean, that's a clear signal.
Right. His point being, if it was general budget trouble, you'd expect cuts spread out more.
Exactly. In a huge agency like NOAA, if they're trimming the budget, you might see a 5% cut here, a hiring freeze there, maybe some travel restrictions. It's usually broader.
Yeah.
But when one specific entire team whose job is public communication on a sensitive topic is just completely eliminated while other things continue, DiLiberto argues that looks less like a budget measure and more like someone specifically wanted that team and that function gone.
A surgical strike, not a blunt instrument.
That's the interpretation. It wasn't a broad sweep. It was very focused.
And the article mentions that who wasn't fired also plays into this perception, according to DiLiberto.
Yes, that's another key piece for him. He points out that reportedly only 2 web developers associated with the climate.gov site were spared. Everyone else on the content side was gone.
Just the tech folks.
Just the tech folks, apparently. And DiLiberto calls this a concerning sign.
Why concerning? What's the logic there?
The thinking seems to be, if you just wanted to shut down climate.gov entirely, get rid of the whole thing, why keep the developers? You'd presumably let go of the technical staff needed to maintain the website infrastructure, along with the people creating the content.
Right. If the site's dead, you don't need the mechanics.
Exactly. So the fact that the technical capacity, the website's backbone, seems to be remaining in place while the content engine is removed, well, that leads the former staff to suspect the platform itself is being kept alive for some reason.
Okay. And given their belief about why the content team was removed?
It fuels further concern about what that future use might be. We'll get more into that later, the co-option fears.
Got it. This whole interpretation, though, it really hinges on the nature of the team itself, the one that got fired. The article really emphasizes that their work was specifically nonpartisan, right? Just focused on the science.
Absolutely crucial. This is central to the former staff's argument about why they believe they were targeted. They stress repeatedly in the source that the content they created for climate.gov was meticulously developed to be politically neutral.
No agenda, just the facts.
Their mandate, as they describe it, was simply to accurately reflect and communicate the current scientific understanding the data about climate. No spin, no political viewpoint.
Just translating the science for the public, warts and all, maybe.
That's the idea. Rebecca Lindsay put it very plainly, according to the source. We operated exactly how you would want an independent, nonpartisan communications group to operate.
Hmm.
And she brings up again that point about being housed in the science division, not public affairs, reinforcing that their foundation was scientific integrity.
So their emphasis on being nonpartisan and science-driven is key to their argument that the firings were an attack on that very approach.
Precisely. It suggests, from their perspective, that they were targeted perhaps because they were committed to neutral, science-based information, especially on a topic like climate, rather than despite it, as if that neutrality itself was the problem for whoever made the call.
Okay, so let's try to piece together that why as presented in the source. The interpretation from the former staff is, this wasn't a random cut. It was a deliberate, targeted removal,
Yes.
targeting the specific team responsible for Climate.gov's content, a team whose defining trait was providing politically neutral, science-based information.
Right.
This was reportedly done using a contract renewal process with the directive perceived as coming from above, linked to the current administration.
That's their reported account.
And the evidence they point to includes how precise the firings were, just this one team,
Yeah.
and the fact that the technical web staff were kept on.
That's the core of the argument presented by the former staff in the article we're discussing.
Okay, that clearly lays out their perspective on the why. Now, let's shift to the so what. What exactly is being lost here? The article seems to argue that Climate.gov and the work this team did was actually pretty valuable and had a wide reach.
Oh, absolutely. The value proposition described in the source is significant, especially when you look at public reach and influence. This wasn't some little visited internal site.
No, what kind of traffic did it get?
The article states it received hundreds of thousands of visits per month.
Hundreds of thousands. Every month. That's a lot of people looking for climate info from this specific source.
It really is a very substantial audience seeking out government information on this topic. The source actually goes further. It describes Climate.gov as one of the most popular sources of information about climate science on the internet.
One of the most popular.
On the whole internet.
That's the description used, which suggests it wasn't just popular for a government site, but it had become a major, go-to, trusted destination for a huge number of people trying to understand climate. Wow. And it wasn't just the website itself, right? They were active elsewhere.
Correct. The team also managed Climate.gov's social media presence. Twitter, Facebook, platforms like that. And according to the article, these accounts had hundreds of thousands of followers.
Okay.
And through those channels, they were consistently reaching millions monthly, sharing articles, graphics, answering questions, extending their reach far beyond just the website visitors.
Millions reached monthly on social media, plus hundreds of thousands visiting the site directly. That's a huge footprint.
It's a massive audience for science communication. And then there's the URL itself.
Climate.gov, yeah, that sounds important.
Tom DiLiberto highlights this in the article. He says climate.gov is one heck of a URL. And he's right. That .gov on the end, it signals official U.S. government information.
Right, it carries instant authority, credibility.
Exactly. A level of trustworthiness that's hard for, private blogs or advocacy groups to match. So you combine that authoritative domain with the popularity they built. Climate.gov held a really unique, powerful spot for putting out reliable science info.
So losing the team that fed that platform, it effectively silences a major authoritative voice that had cultivated a massive audience.
That's a direct consequence, yeah. But the article emphasizes another crucial role they played, beyond just publishing stuff, combating misinformation.
Ah, right.
All right.
In today's online world, that's huge. How are they involved in that?
This is framed as one of the really big losses. The source calls the team an extremely well-trusted source for climate information, misinformation, and disinformation. They weren't just passively posting facts.
They were actively fighting the bad info.
Apparently, yes. They were engaged in actively correcting false narratives, providing accurate counterpoints right out there in the public square, so to speak.
How did that actually work? What did they do?
The contractor interviewed gives some specifics. They said, we actually legitimately would answer misinformation questions. So people would send in questions based on stuff they'd heard.
Maybe myths or misleading claims?
Exactly. And this team would take the time to answer them directly, using the actual science. They'd also answer reader emails coming through the website. And importantly, they would try to combat disinformation on social media.
So wading into the comments sections, responding to false claims on Twitter, things like that.
It sounds like it. Directly engaging on those platforms where misinformation can spread like wildfire.
It takes effort. And guts, probably.
No doubt. And the contractor adds another interesting observation. They apparently noticed that attacks on their social media accounts, specifically from climate change skeptics, had ramped up significantly in the 6 months or so before the firings.
Really? So they were becoming more of a target.
It seems so, which you could argue suggests their role as a reliable source pushing back against skepticism was being felt and maybe becoming even more critical.
So you have this online ecosystem just swimming in misinformation, especially about climate. And here was a trusted, government-backed team actively trying to correct the record.
Right, using science-based information.
And now they're gone, which creates a vacuum.
That's the implication in the source. Without that team doing the proactive engagement, the corrections, the article suggests misinformation might flourish there more readily.
Yeah, either on the climate.gov channels themselves, if they're left unattended, or just generally because a strong countervoice is gone.
It's not just losing access to good information, it's losing a force that was actively fighting the bad information.
That's a really important dimension. And the article also clarifies that their work wasn't just about climate change, right?
Yeah.
The term climate was broader for them.
Yes, the contractor made sure to point that out. They emphasized that climate, as the team covered it, is more broad than just climate change.
What else did it include?
Critically, it included understanding and explaining those natural cyclical climate patterns that have huge impacts on our year-to-year weather. Things like El Niño and La Niña.
Okay, yeah, ENSO cycles. Those are massive drivers of seasonal weather.
Huge. They influence everything: rainfall, temperature, drought, hurricane seasons, agricultural planning, water resources. You name it, affects communities directly and immediately.
So stopping the flow of information from climate.gov isn't only about the long-term climate change discussion. It also hits public understanding of these major recurring weather drivers that affect us now.
That's a key point the contractor makes. They argue that stopping this broader climate information flow is a disservice to the public. And there's one more piece.
What's that?
The site also served as a way to communicate the results of publicly funded research conducted by NOAA scientists more generally.
So not just climate-specific stuff, but potentially other NOAA research findings too.
It suggests the impact could ripple out, potentially making it harder for the public to learn about a wider range of NOAA's scientific work that, taxpayers funded.
Okay, let's sum up this value lost section then. According to the source, we're losing a platform with enormous public reach, hundreds of thousands monthly to the site, millions via social media.
Right, one of the most popular online sources for this info.
A team seen as an extremely trusted source, actively fighting misinformation in a really difficult online environment.
A crucial role.
Their work covered not just long-term climate change, but also vital shorter-term climate patterns like El Niño, La Niña that directly impacts weather and preparedness.
Yep, a broader climate picture.
And it also helped share results from other publicly funded NOAA research. Stopping the content basically shuts down all those public services.
It really highlights how multifaceted their job was. It wasn't just reporting data, it was active public service, helping people understand and navigate environmental information.
Okay, given everything we've discussed, the sudden firings, the way it happened, the interpretation of why it happened, and the value of what's lost, the article then turns to the future. And there are some serious concerns raised, specifically about the climate.gov website itself.
Yes. The worry isn't necessarily just that the site will go dark or become a static archive. The article raises what Rebecca Lindsay called a sinister possibility.
Sinister possibility. What is it?
The possibility that the administration might not just abandon climate.gov, but might actually co-opt it.
Co-opt means
Meaning take over the existing website, the infrastructure, the trusted.gov domain name, maybe even the social media accounts with all those followers, and start publishing their own content.
content that might be different.
Content that might not stick to the same standards of scientific neutrality or accuracy that the original team was committed to. That's the fear.
So the worry isn't just losing a good resource. It's that the resource itself, the brand, could be hijacked and used for a different purpose.
Precisely. It's a concern echoed really strongly by the former contractor quoted. They expressed a major worry about seeing the site turn into a propaganda website for this administration, because that's not at all what it was.
Wow, propaganda website, they used that term.
Explicitly, according to the source. The fear is that the credibility built up over years, the audience reach, the authority of the .gov address, all of that could be exploited to push a specific political narrative rather than the science it was founded on.
And this connects back to DiLiberto's point about keeping the web developers.
Absolutely, it fits right in. His observation that keeping the tech staff suggests they want to do something with later, well, that directly feeds this co-option fear.
Right. If you keep the mechanics, it implies you plan to drive the car somewhere else later.
That's the interpretation presented. Preserving the platform's infrastructure isn't seen by the former staff as an effort to maybe revive the science communication later, but potentially to use the platform itself for different communications down the road, communications that might clash with the original mission.
So the ultimate fear is that the audience and trust, built by a team focused on scientific integrity, could be handed over, leveraged by a completely different group with a potentially opposing agenda.
That is the core of what Lindsay described as the worst-case scenario. She actually voiced concern, according to the article, that a different content team could be brought in.
Like who? Did she give examples?
She apparently mentioned the Heartland Institute as an example. That's a group often associated with skepticism towards mainstream climate science.
Okay, so the fear is someone like that could come in.
And start leveraging our audience, our brand, our millions of people that we reach on social media every month. That's the quote attributed to her.
So hijacking the platform built on science cred.
And using its reach for messaging that could, based on that example, fundamentally contradict the very science the site was originally meant to explain.
That is. Yeah, that's a particularly concerning potential outcome. Taking a public resource built on trust in science and potentially weaponizing it against that science, using its own audience.
That is the future scenario that the former staff, as reported in the article, seem to view with the most alarm. It suggests the motive might be less about just silencing the science and more about controlling the narrative on a very visible government stage.
Okay, let's zoom out for a second. The article doesn't just talk about climate.gov in isolation, right? It puts these events into a bigger picture, mentioning broader cuts to science funding.
Yes, that context is definitely provided. The source is clear that the climate.gov situation is not presented as some weird one-off event. It explicitly states the content team's dismissal happened amid broader cuts to science funding across the government.
So part of a larger pattern affecting federal science generally.
That's the framing. It positions these specific actions within a wider trend of apparently reduced investment and support for government science programs.
And does it mention other specific impacts within NOAA itself in this broader context?
It does, yeah. The source notes that inside NOAA specifically, there are reportedly significant reductions to education, grants, research, and climate-related programs.
Education, grants, research, and climate programs. That sounds like core functions. Where is this information coming from?
It's situated within the context of the 2026 Passback budget.
Passback budget. Can you quickly explain what that is?
Sure. Basically, in the federal budget process, agencies submit their requests, and then the White House Office of Management and Budget, OMB, reviews them and sends back their decisions and priorities. That's the passback. It reflects the administration's proposed spending levels and cuts before the official budget goes to Congress.
Okay, so this is the administration's blueprint for NOAA's funding currently being developed or discussed.
Exactly. And the article is saying that this blueprint, this passback budget, includes these proposed significant cuts to fundamental areas within NOAA: funding for educating scientists, money for research grants, support for internal research, and other climate programs.
So it's not just this one website team. It's potentially cuts across the board in areas essential for actually doing the science, supporting it, and training the next generation.
That seems to be the picture presented. The article uses these broader proposed cuts as context, suggesting the climate.gov situation might be just one visible piece of a larger strategic approach affecting federal science under this administration.
And this leads to an interpretation, again from Tom DiLiberto, about what the overall strategy might be.
Yeah, he offers a really interesting take that kind of ties it all together. He's quoted saying something like, "It seems like if they can't get rid of all the research, what they can do is make it impossible for anyone to know about it."
So the strategy isn't necessarily to stop the science itself. Maybe that's too hard or legally required.
Right, maybe politically tricky or just too embedded.
But you achieve a similar result by just cutting off the communication channels, making sure the findings don't get out to the public.
That's the interpretation offered in the source. By targeting the public-facing arms, like the climate.gov content team, the administration, according to this view, makes it much, much harder for the science the public paid for to actually reach and inform that public.
It's a strategy of obscuration, maybe. Sidelining the science in the public sphere even if the labs are still running to some degree.
That's how it's being interpreted by Diliberto in the article, yes. Control the flow of information or stop it altogether.
And the article stresses that the consequences of this approach, cutting off communication, they go beyond just limiting knowledge about, say, long-term human-caused climate change. There are immediate practical impacts.
Absolutely. The contractor interviewed voices this worry very strongly. They fear that this action, even if maybe intended primarily to downplay human-caused climate change info, will inevitably have broader impacts on public education on the cyclical drivers of weather, too, like El Niño and La Niña, things we need to know about for seasonal preparedness.
Right, because those patterns directly affect floods, droughts, hurricane seasons, farming, things people need to plan for now.
Exactly. And the site also shared findings from general NOAA research, not just climate change stuff. So awareness of that broader science could also take a hit.
So the fallout isn't just in the realm of abstract climate debates. It potentially impacts how well communities and individuals can prepare for and respond to actual weather extremes and variations.
That's precisely the connection the contractor makes, and it's powerful. They state, hiding the impacts of climate change won't stop it from happening. It will just make us far less prepared when it does.
Wow, that really brings it home. Access to clear, reliable science communication isn't just nice to have, it's fundamental for public safety and readiness.
It underscores that these government science communication platforms, they serve a vital practical function for public well-being, not just an academic one. Silencing them potentially weakens our collective ability to prepare.
Okay, this has been a really detailed look. Let's try to quickly recap the main points from the source material we've unpacked. We started with the situation at climate.gov. The sudden dismissal of the entire content team on May 31st, leaving the site's future uncertain following earlier key personnel changes.
Got it. The what happened.
Then we explored the why, specifically the interpretation reported in the article from the former staff. They view it as a deliberate, targeted action, potentially linked to the administration, aimed at restricting public climate information and carried out via contract modifications.
Right, their perspective on the motivations.
We discussed the significant value Climate.gov apparently provided: huge reach, trusted source status, active role-fighting misinformation, and covering broad climate topics including El Niño, La Niña, plus other NOAA research.
So what was lost?
And then the serious concerns about the future, especially the fear that the site could be co-opted, its brand and audience potentially repurposed for messaging that might contradict its original scientific mission.
The what might happen next fear.
Yeah. And finally, we place this within the reported broader context of proposed cuts to science funding at NOAA and across government, with some interpreting this as a strategy to limit public knowledge of publicly funded research by cutting off communication.
That covers the main points from the source, I think.
So what's really at stake here, based on this reporting, it seems substantial. We're talking about the potential loss of a very established, very popular, trusted, and importantly, nonpartisan source for public info on climate science, weather patterns, and NOAA research.
Right. A significant public resource potentially gone or fundamentally changed.
And the article suggests that reducing this kind of credible communication could allow misinformation to spread more easily, filling that void.
A definite concern raised.
And ultimately, as that contractor pointed out, hindering access to this scientific understanding isn't just academic. It could have real practical consequences, potentially making us less prepared for actual weather and climate events that affect communities.
Yeah, that preparedness angle is critical. For you, the listener, having reliable access to clear, unbiased info straight from authoritative government sources like climate.gov was, well, it's essential, really.
Awesome.
It helps you navigate the complexities, right? Understand the risks maybe facing your own community, make informed decisions, whether that's in local planning meetings or just understanding why the weather seems so weird lately. It's fundamentally about ensuring the science your tax dollars paid for remains accessible and actually useful to you.
Exactly. It feels like it boils down to the public's right to know, to access and understand the scientific work being done supposedly on our behalf.
Well put.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, here's maybe a final thought to chew on, building on that context we discussed. If the interpretation presented in the source holds water, that one strategy might be to limit public awareness of government research by shutting down communication channels like climate.gov. What other areas of government science, beyond weather and climate, might be facing similar hurdles, similar challenges in getting their findings out to you, the public? It makes you wonder about the pathways for scientific information generally.
That's a really thought-provoking question. Where else might communication be getting squeezed, and what are the downstream effects?
Something to think about. For more insights on weather and climate specifically, remember you can follow meteorologist Rob Jones. He's on Instagram at meteorologist, on TikTok at TV Meteorologist, and on YouTube, search for Rob Jones Hurricane. That's also where you can find the Meteorology Matters podcast playlist.
And thank you for joining us for this Meteorology Matters deep dive.
We really hope exploring this source article has helped shed some light on these reported events and what they might mean. Thanks for listening.